London, 1815. In a world where reputation is currency and scandal is the most traded commodity, there lived a woman whose greatest sin was loving a man who refused to love her back. Lady Isolde Fairmont, the Duchess of Ravensworth, stood before her bedroom mirror, examining the hollow shadows beneath her eyes that even the most skilled lady's maid could no longer conceal. 3 years. 3 years of marriage to a man who had never once reached for her in the darkness. 3 years of polite conversation over breakfast tables, of separate bedchambers, of longing glances that went unnoticed, or perhaps, more cruelly, ignored. The Tun whispered, "Of course. They always did. A marriage without an heir was like a garden without flowers, pointless, barren, and subject to endless speculation." What they didn't know was how Isolde's heart fractured a little more each time her husband, the illustrious Duke of Ravensworth, bowed formally before retiring to his own chambers each night. Winterly Ravensworth was a puzzle the ladies of London had long given up solving. Impossibly handsome with his raven hair and piercing blue eyes, wealthy beyond measure, intelligent to the point of intimidation, and cold, so terribly cold. Tonight was the Harrington Ball, the social event that had introduced them 4 years ago. The night she had first felt the peculiar ache of wanting something she could never have. Isolde smoothed the silk of her gown, a shade of emerald that made her eyes appear like spring leaves after rain. Let him see what he has refused to touch, she thought with uncharacteristic bitterness. The knock at her chamber door was precise. 3 raps, evenly spaced. Even his knocking lacked passion. The Duke entered, resplendent in black evening attire that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his form. His cravat was impeccable, his expression impassible. "Your carriage awaits, Duchess." The title, never her name. Always the title. "Shall we present a united front tonight, Your Grace?" Isolde asked, her voice steady despite the storm within. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her directness. "As always," he replied. "As always." 2 words that carried the weight of all that was wrong between them. What Isolde didn't realize was that tonight, everything would change. For while she prepared to endure another evening of painful pretense, fate was already in motion. By tomorrow morning, the Duchess of Ravensworth would be gone, and the Duke would finally understand what it meant to lose something he never knew he wanted. The Harrington ballroom glittered with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in countless jewels, the chandeliers throwing diamond patterns across the marble floor, where London's elite swirled in a choreographed display of wealth and status. Lady Whistledown would have much to report tomorrow, Isolde thought as she entered on her husband's arm. "The Ravensworths have arrived," announced the footman, his voice carrying over the orchestra's gentle melody. Conversation briefly faltered. Eyes turned. Fans fluttered to conceal whispered observations. 3 years of marriage and still no heir. They say he keeps separate chambers. Perhaps the Duke regrets his choice. Perhaps the Duchess is barren. Isolde had learned to read lips across ballrooms, a necessary skill when one's marriage was London's favorite enigma. The Duke guided her through the crowd with practiced ease, his gloved hand barely touching the small of her back. Even through layers of fabric, Isolde felt the heat of that small contact like a brand. Lady Harrington descended upon them, her plump face alight with the pleasure of securing the attendance of a duke at her ball. "Your Grace and the lovely Duchess, we are honored indeed." "The pleasure is ours, Lady Harrington," the Duke replied smoothly. "Your ballroom is exquisite." As Winterly engaged in the required pleasantries, Isolde felt another presence at her side. "Lady Isolde," a familiar voice murmured. Lady Rebecca Blackwood, once her dearest friend, now something more complicated. The woman who had spread the first whispers about Isolde's family before her marriage, whispers that had made Isolde desperate enough to accept the Duke's unexpected proposal. "Rebecca," Isolde acknowledged with a nod. "You look well, as do you, though perhaps a touch tired. Marriage to the Duke must be demanding." The words dripped with insinuation, and Isolde felt rather than saw her husband stiffen beside her. "On the contrary," Isolde replied, summoning a serene smile. "His Grace is consideration itself." Rebecca's answering smile didn't reach her eyes. How fortunate, though one does wonder why such consideration hasn't yet produced an heir. Before Isolde could respond, the Duke's voice cut through the tension. Lady Blackwood, I believe your husband is searching for you. And Duchess, I believe this is our dance. He had never claimed a dance with her at any ball in 3 years of marriage. Isolde allowed herself to be led to the dance floor, heart thundering beneath her ribs as the Duke's hand closed firmly around her waist. The music began. A waltz, intimate, scandalous still in some circles. You didn't have to rescue me, she said as they moved in perfect synchronicity. I've grown quite accustomed to Rebecca's barbs. The Duke's jaw tightened. And I've grown weary of them. They turned, his hand firm at her waist, his eyes focused somewhere above her head. Isolde took a breath. Why did you marry me? The question hung between them, dangerous and exposed. For 3 years she had never dared ask directly. The Duke missed a step, almost imperceptible, but to Isolde, who had studied every nuance of this man, it was as clear as a shout. This is hardly the place for such a discussion, Duchess. And where would be the place? Isolde persisted, emboldened by the public setting that ensured his continued civility. Your study, where you retreat each evening? My chambers, which you've never entered? The breakfast table where we discuss nothing but the weather? Something dangerous flashed in the Duke's eyes. You forget yourself, he said, his voice low. No, she replied, her voice equally quiet but steady. I've remembered myself, finally. As the dance ended, the Duke bowed formally, his expression once again a mask of perfect control. Isolde cursed, equally composed, though her heart raced with the aftermath of her unprecedented boldness. As she turned to leave the dance floor, she caught sight of Rebecca watching them, a calculating gleam in her eye. Little did Isolde know that by morning, Rebecca's machinations would be the least of her concerns, for something was already in motion, something that would shatter the careful facade they had built and force the Duke to confront the truth he had denied for 3 long years. Dawn had barely broken when the Duke of Ravensworth was awakened by frantic knocking at his chamber door. Your Grace, Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, called through the wood. Forgive the intrusion, but it's the Duchess, sir. Winterly was immediately alert, swinging his long legs over the side of the bed and reaching for his robe. What about the Duchess? He demanded, pulling open the door to find Mrs. Winters wringing her hands, face pale with distress. She's gone, Your Grace. Gone where? He asked, irritation masking a sudden, inexplicable flicker of alarm. We don't know, sir. Her bed is unslept in. Her lady's maid has not seen her since helping her undress after the ball. And there's a note, Your Grace. Show me, he commanded, following the housekeeper through the corridors of Ravensworth House to the Duchess's chambers. The room was exactly as Isolde had left it, gown draped carefully over a chair, jewels returned to their velvet-lined box. Nothing appeared disturbed or taken in haste, except that Isolde herself was absent. The note lay on her silver vanity, a single sheet of her personal stationery folded once. Winterly picked it up, steeling himself against the tremor in his fingers. Perhaps love grows best in absence. 7 words. No signature was needed. The Duke stared at the elegant script, reading and rereading as though additional words might materialize to explain this cryptic message. Has anyone seen the Duchess leave? He asked, his voice unnaturally calm. No, Your Grace. No carriage was called. The footmen on night duty saw nothing. Alert the staff. Search the grounds, the conservatory, the library, every room. Perhaps she has taken ill somewhere in the house. Mrs. Winters nodded, though her expression suggested she doubted this explanation. And Mrs. Winters, the Duke added as she turned to leave. Discretion is paramount. This matter remains within these walls until I determine otherwise. Left alone in his wife's chamber, Winterly allowed himself to truly look at the space she occupied. In 3 years, he had entered this room only a handful of times, always briefly, always with purpose. Now he saw the details he had never permitted himself to notice. Books of poetry stacked beside her bed, a half-finished embroidery depicting the gardens at Ravensworth, a small portrait of her parents, both lost to fever when she was 16, and on her writing desk, a leather-bound journal. The Duke hesitated. Even in this extraordinary circumstance, a gentleman did not read a lady's private thoughts, and yet if it might explain her disappearance. He opened the journal, finding not the expected entries of daily life, but something far more unexpected. Pages of careful observations about the estate's tenants, who needed new roofing before winter, which family had a child showing scholarly promise, how the widow Brown might be secretly assisted without wounding her pride. These were matters he had delegated to his steward, matters he assumed were handled adequately if impersonally. Yet here was evidence that his wife had been intimately involved in the welfare of those under his protection, without ever seeking acknowledgement or praise. Why had she never spoken of this work? But he knew why. Because in 3 years he had never asked, had never shown interest in anything beyond her performance of ducal duties at dinner parties and social functions. The Duke closed the journal, a weight settling in his chest. The search of the house proved fruitless. Isolde had vanished as completely as morning mist under summer sun. By midday, Winterly was forced to acknowledge that more decisive action was required. He summoned his most trusted servant, Hawkins, the Duke said to his valet and sometimes confidant, a man who had been with him since boyhood. Prepare my traveling clothes and have the fastest horses readied, and send for Inspector Morris. Discreetly. Where will you go, Your Grace? Hawkins asked, already moving to select appropriate attire. Winterly looked down at the note still clutched in his hand. Perhaps love grows best in absence. To find my wife, he said, a new determination hardening his voice. Wherever she may be. What Winterly didn't yet understand was that finding Isolde would require more than physical searching. It would demand that he finally confront the walls he had built around his heart. Walls constructed long before he had ever laid eyes on the woman who would become his Duchess. For the first time in 3 years, the Duke of Ravensworth felt fear. Not the calculated concern of a man whose property had gone missing, but the visceral terror of a man who suddenly realized he might lose something irreplaceable. Something he had never allowed himself to claim in the first place. As London society buzzed with speculation about the mysteriously absent Duchess of Ravensworth, Isolde herself was watching the English countryside roll past the window of a modest but comfortable coach. The rocking motion had nearly lulled her to sleep when the vehicle slowed, turning onto a narrow lane lined with ancient oaks. "We've arrived, my lady," called the driver. Isolde peered through the window at the stone cottage nestled against the backdrop of gentle rolling hills. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the garden, though autumn faded, spoke of careful tending. The door of the cottage opened before Isolde had even descended from the carriage, revealing a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that matched Isolde's own. "You're earlier than expected," the woman said, her voice warm with welcome. Isolde felt the tension begin to drain from her shoulders. The roads were clear, Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor Fairmont embraced her niece tightly, then held her at arm's length for inspection. "You're too thin," she pronounced, "and there are shadows beneath your eyes that speak of more than just a tiresome journey." Isolde managed a small smile. "I've come at an inconvenient time." "Nonsense. There is never an inconvenient time for family. Though I admit your letter took me by surprise. 3 years of marriage, and only now does my niece seek refuge with her disreputable spinster aunt." "You're hardly disreputable," Isolde protested as they entered the cottage. "Father always said you were the wisest of the Fairmonts. Your father was kind to say so, even after I scandalized the family by refusing 3 perfectly acceptable proposals and choosing to live independently on my modest inheritance. Now sit by the fire while I prepare tea, and then you shall tell me everything." As Isolde settled into a comfortable chair by the hearth, she took in her surroundings. Her aunt's cottage was modestly furnished but filled with evidence of a rich life. Books lining every wall, a piano in the corner, watercolor landscapes that Eleanor herself had painted. It was nothing like the grand, imposing luxury of Ravensworth House, and yet it felt more like a home than any place Isolde had lived since her parents' death. When Eleanor returned with a tea tray, Isolde found herself suddenly overwhelmed. Tears she had refused to shed in London spilled freely down her cheeks. "Oh, my dear girl," Eleanor murmured, setting down the tray and coming to kneel beside Isolde's chair. What has he done to you? Nothing, Isolde managed between sobs. That's precisely the problem. 3 years of nothing. Eleanor's expression darkened. I had heard rumors, of course. The Ton loves nothing more than to speculate about the domestic arrangements of a duke. But I had hoped. Isolde wiped her tears, drawing a steadying breath. I don't know why I'm crying now. I've endured it for 3 years without breaking. Perhaps because you finally allowed yourself to feel the full weight of it, Eleanor suggested gently. Now, drink your tea and tell me everything from the beginning. So Isolde did. She spoke of her desperate situation after her parents' deaths, of the whispers that had threatened her reputation, of the unexpected proposal from the Duke of Ravensworth that had seemed like salvation. He was so kind during our courtship, she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Not warm, precisely, but attentive. Considerate. I thought perhaps in time. Eleanor's expression was thoughtful. And after the wedding? After the wedding, it was as if a wall descended between us. He was unfailingly polite, ensured I wanted for nothing material, but there was a distance he maintained. I tried everything. Conversation, shared interests, even attempts at seduction, though it shames me to admit it. Isolde, there is no shame in desiring your husband, Eleanor said firmly. The shame is his for treating you with such neglect. Isolde stared into the flames. The worst part is not knowing why. If I had displeased him somehow, if there was something I could change, but he gives me nothing. Not even anger. Just perfect cold courtesy. And this is why you've left? To punish him? Isolde shook her head. Not to punish. To save myself. I realized I was disappearing, becoming as hollow as our marriage. I needed to remember who I was before I became the Duchess of Ravensworth. Eleanor nodded approvingly. And the note you left him? Perhaps love grows best in absence, Isolde quoted. It was something Mother once said to Father when he returned from a long journey. She claimed his absence had made her love him even more fiercely. Eleanor smiled sadly. Your mother was a romantic. But what do you hope to accomplish with this disappearance? Isolde's gaze returned to the fire. I don't know. Perhaps nothing. But for the first time in 3 years, I've taken action instead of simply enduring. That alone feels like victory. What Eleanor didn't tell her niece was that she had her own suspicions about the Duke's behavior. Suspicions based on old connections and older gossip. Information that might explain, if not excuse, the wall Winterly Ravensworth had built between himself and his Duchess. Information that Isolde deserved to know but that Eleanor would need to confirm before sharing. Rest tonight, Eleanor said, patting Isolde's hand. Tomorrow we shall discuss your future, whatever shape you wish it to take. What Isolde didn't yet realize was that her impulsive flight had set in motion events that would soon bring the Duke himself to this very doorstep. A man transformed by the sudden, terrifying prospect of losing something he had never truly possessed. The Duke of Ravensworth's study at his London residence had become the center of a carefully managed investigation. Maps were spread across the mahogany desk, correspondence sorted into precise stacks, and a log of all inquiries meticulously maintained. It had been 5 days since the Duchess's disappearance. 5 days of searching, questioning, and growing dread. 5 days in which Winterly had barely slept, barely eaten, driven by an urgency he could neither name nor contain. Inspector Morris, a discreet and highly competent investigator, often employed by the aristocracy when scandal threatened, stood before the Duke's desk. Your Grace, with respect, we must consider widening our search. Lady Isolde's disappearance appears increasingly deliberate rather than forced. Winterly's jaw tightened. You believe my wife has fled of her own accord? The evidence suggests as much, Your Grace. No signs of struggle, no demands for ransom. The note in her handwriting. And we've now confirmed that she withdrew a significant sum from her personal accounts 2 days before her departure. Why would she leave? Winterly demanded. Though the question was directed more at himself than the inspector, Morris hesitated, then spoke carefully. Your Grace, it is not my place to speculate on the private matters between a husband and wife. Speak plainly, Inspector. I have no patience for delicacy when my wife is missing. Very well. The staff report that the Duchess has appeared increasingly melancholy in recent months, and there are certain rumors about the nature of your marriage that might explain. The Duke cut him off with a sharp gesture. I am well aware of the rumors, Inspector. I had simply believed my wife possessed more sense than to give them credence, as you say, Your Grace. Nevertheless, I believe our best course is to discreetly investigate Lady Isolda's connections outside London. Family, childhood friends, anyone who might have offered her sanctuary. Winterly nodded curtly. Proceed. But maintain absolute discretion. I will not have my wife's reputation tarnished by public speculation. After the inspector departed, Winterly remained at his desk, staring at the note that had not left his possession since the morning of Isolda's disappearance. Perhaps love grows best in absence. Was it possible? Had Isolda left willingly, driven by the coldness of their marriage? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called. Hawkins appeared, his normally impassive face showing signs of concern. Your Grace, Lady Blackwood is here. She insists on seeing you regarding a matter of great urgency concerning the Duchess. Winterly frowned. Lady Rebecca Blackwood had once been Isolda's closest friend, but their relationship had cooled noticeably in recent years. What could she know of Isolda's whereabouts? Show her in, he instructed. Lady Blackwood swept into the study moments later, her fashionable mourning attire, her husband having died the previous year, a stark contrast to the room's rich colors. Your Grace, she began without preamble, I've just heard the most alarming rumors about Isolda's absence. Please tell me they're unfounded. Winterly gestured to a chair. Lady Blackwood, what exactly have you heard? Rebecca settled gracefully into the offered seat. That the Duchess has vanished without trace. That the household is in disarray. That you suspect foul play. Winterly's expression remained neutral. The Duchess is currently away from London. The rest is speculation. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice dropping to a concerned whisper. Winterly, forgive the familiarity. We have known each other since we were children. I consider Isolda a dear friend, despite our occasional differences. If she is in trouble, I wish to help. The Duke studied her carefully. Rebecca Blackwood had indeed been part of the same social circle since childhood, but he had never considered her particularly trustworthy. If you truly wish to help, perhaps you could shed light on my wife's state of mind before her departure. You spoke with her at the Harrington ball, did you not? Rebecca's expression flickered briefly. I did, though our conversation was brief. She seemed distracted, unhappy. And did she give any indication of her plans? None. But then, Isolda and I have not shared confidences as we once did. Not since you spread rumors about her family's financial difficulties before our marriage, Winterly finished coldly. Rebecca had the grace to flush, an indiscretion I have long regretted. But surely you don't think that ancient history has any bearing on her current disappearance? I think, Lady Blackwood, that you are perhaps not the friend to my wife that you claim to be. Rebecca stood, indignation straightening her spine. I came here out of concern, Your Grace, but I see my goodwill is misplaced. As she reached the door, she paused, turning back with a calculating look. I wonder, Duke, if you've considered that Isolda might not wish to be found. After all, a wife who is neither loved nor with child after 3 years of marriage might seek fulfillment elsewhere. The door closed behind her before Winterly could respond, leaving him with a cold fury building in his chest. Rebecca Blackwood knew something. Of that, he was certain. But more disturbing was the seed of doubt she had planted. A doubt that had been growing since the moment he'd read Isolda's note. Had his wife left him by choice? And if so, what did that reveal about the marriage he had believed? If not warm, at least acceptable. For the first time, Winterly forced himself to confront a possibility he had avoided for 3 years. That in protecting himself from the vulnerability of true intimacy, he might have inflicted a wound so deep that his wife had chosen freedom over the gilded cage of their marriage. The thought was unexpectedly, profoundly painful. That evening, as Winterly sat alone in his study long after the household had retired, Hawkins entered with an envelope on a silver tray. This just arrived by special messenger, Your Grace. The Duke opened it with uncharacteristic haste, hope flaring as he recognized the handwriting, not Isolde's, but familiar nonetheless. As he read the brief message, his expression changed from anticipation to grim determination. Have the carriage prepared for first light, Hawkins. We leave for Derbyshire tomorrow. Very good, Your Grace, Hawkins replied, not betraying his surprise at this sudden development. Shall I inform the staff of your expected return? Winterly folded the letter and placed it in his coat pocket. No, he said quietly, for I do not know when, or if, I shall return. The autumn morning was crisp and bright, the kind of day that seemed to mock misery with its perfect beauty. Isolde walked along the narrow path behind her aunt's cottage, breathing deeply of air scented with fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. A week in Derbyshire had begun to restore something she had feared lost forever, herself. Here, away from the constraints of London society and ducal expectations, she wore simple dresses, let her hair fall in a single braid down her back, and spent hours reading or helping her aunt in the garden without a thought for appearances. Eleanor had not pressed her about plans or decisions, allowing Isolde the space to simply exist without the weight of her title or her troubled marriage. But as she rounded the bend in the path that led back to the cottage, Isolde spotted a carriage on the narrow lane, an elegant, expensive carriage that was unmistakably from London. Her heart froze. He had found her. Isolde considered fleeing into the woods, avoiding the confrontation she had known must eventually come, but pride stiffened her spine. She would not hide like a guilty thing. She had done nothing wrong except seek sanctuary from a marriage that had become a beautiful, empty shell. As she approached the cottage, the door opened, and Eleanor appeared, her expression carefully neutral. Your husband has arrived, she said simply. Isolde nodded, smoothing her hands over her plain muslin dress, suddenly conscious of how different she must look from the polished Duchess of Ravensworth. I should change, she began, but Eleanor shook her head. Let him see you as you are, not as he has forced you to become. Taking a steadying breath, Isolde entered the cottage. The Duke of Ravensworth stood by the hearth, his tall figure dominating the modest room. He turned as she entered, and Isolde was shocked by his appearance. Winterly had always been immaculate, controlled, perfect in every detail of dress and manner. The man before her now looked as though he had hardly slept in days. His cravat was precisely tied, his coat unwrinkled, yet there was a haggardness to his features, a tension in his posture that spoke of deep distress. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching taut between them. Duchess, he finally said, his voice formal despite the informality of their surroundings. Duke, she returned with equal formality. Eleanor cleared her throat. I shall leave you to speak privately. The tea is ready when you wish it. Once they were alone, Winterly spoke first. You've caused quite a commotion with your disappearance. Have I? Isolde replied, keeping her voice steady. I left a note. I assumed you would understand that I wished for time away. Time away, he repeated, a muscle working in his jaw. Is that what you call vanishing without warning, without escort, without explanation beyond 7 cryptic words? Isolde met his gaze directly. Would you have permitted my departure had I requested it formally? Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her directness. That is beside the point. Your actions were reckless and beneath your dignity as Duchess. Isolde laughed, a short, bitter sound. My dignity as Duchess. Yes, that has always been your primary concern, hasn't it? That I perform my role flawlessly, that I reflect well upon your title. Never mind the woman beneath the title. Winterly's expression tightened. I have provided everything a duchess could require. Except a husband, Isolde responded, the words escaping before she could reconsider. 3 years, Winterly. 3 years of politeness and distance. 3 years of separate chambers and careful avoidance. 3 years of a marriage in name only. The Duke turned away, staring into the fire. If our arrangement has been so unbearable, why did you not speak of it before now? Isolde moved to stand before him, forcing him to meet her gaze. I did speak of it, in 100 small ways. Every time I invited conversation beyond pleasantries, every time I suggested activities we might share, every time I entered a room and watched you find reason to leave it. Until finally, I realized you preferred our marriage exactly as it was. A convenient arrangement that fulfilled social obligations without requiring emotional involvement. Winterly's face was a mask of control, but something in his eyes had changed. A flicker of realization, perhaps, or regret. And now, he asked quietly, "What do you want now, Isolde?" It was the first time in years he had spoken her given name. The sound of it in his voice sent an unwelcome shiver through her. "I want," she began, then faltered, unprepared for the question. "I want to remember who I am beyond the title you gave me. I want to determine if there is anything between us worth salvaging. I want truth, Winterly. After 3 years of perfect falseness, I want truth." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the fire. "The truth," he finally said, his voice so low she had to step closer to hear him, "is that I have failed as a husband, in ways I am only beginning to comprehend." Isolde felt her breath catch. In all her imaginings of this confrontation, she had never expected anything approaching admission or apology. Before she could respond, he continued, still addressing the flames rather than her face. "I believed I was providing what a wife required: security, position, material comfort. I did not consider that you might want more." "More," she echoed softly. Such a small word for all that has been missing. Finally, he turned to her, and the raw emotion in his eyes startled her. "I have spent 5 days searching for you," he said, his voice rough-edged. 5 days in which I have slept little, eaten less, and questioned everything I thought I understood about our marriage, about myself." He took a step toward her, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of beard on his jaw, smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and leather that had always been uniquely his. "I do not know how to be the husband you deserve, Isolde, but these days of your absence have shown me that I cannot bear the alternative." Isolde felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. It was too easy, too convenient that 5 days of worry should erase 3 years of neglect. "Words are simple, Winterly," she said, maintaining the distance between them. "Actions are what matter, and your actions for 3 years have spoken clearly of your indifference." "Not indifference," he countered, a flash of something like pain crossing his features. "Fear." "Fear?" she repeated, genuinely confused. What could the powerful Duke of Ravensworth possibly fear? Winterly hesitated, clearly struggling with words that did not come easily to him. "I think," he said slowly, "that this conversation requires tea, and perhaps your aunt's presence. For there are things you should know, things I should have told you before we married." Isolde studied him, trying to read the truth in his face. Whatever he wished to reveal clearly cost him greatly. "I'll call her," she said finally. As she moved toward the door, his voice stopped her. "Isolde," he said softly, "you look beautiful. Here. Like this." She turned back, startled by the unexpected words, the naked honesty in his tone. "More beautiful than I have ever seen you in the finest gowns and jewels of London." For the first time in 3 years, Isolde glimpsed something in her husband's eyes that looked remarkably like admiration. Or perhaps something deeper, something she had long since stopped hoping to see. And despite her best intentions, despite 3 years of disappointment and loneliness, she felt a treacherous flicker of hope ignite in her heart. Aunt Eleanor poured tea with the deliberate care of someone choosing their moment to speak. The Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth sat across from each other in the cottage's small sitting room, the tension between them palpable. "I assume," Eleanor finally said, looking directly at Winterly, "that you're prepared to explain why you've treated my niece with such deplorable coldness for 3 years of marriage." "Aunt Eleanor!" Isolde protested, shocked by her aunt's directness. Winterly, however, did not appear offended. He met Eleanor's challenging gaze steadily. "Your candor is refreshing, Lady Eleanor, and deserved." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at his response. "Then perhaps you might begin with why you proposed to Isolde in the first place, when it's abundantly clear you had no intention of making her a true wife." Isolde watched her husband, curious despite herself. It was a question she had asked herself countless times over the years. Winterly set down his teacup with careful precision. "I proposed because I admired her, because she conducted herself with grace and dignity despite the whispers that threatened her standing, Because she was intelligent, well-read, and would make an excellent duchess in all the ways that mattered to society. Isolde felt a familiar disappointment settle in her chest. It was as she had suspected, a calculated decision, not a matter of the heart. But Winterly wasn't finished. And because, he continued more quietly now, from our first meeting, there was something about her that disturbed my composure, something that made me think dangerous thoughts about happiness and possibility. Isolde stared at him, trying to reconcile these words with 3 years of distance. If that were true, she said carefully, why then did you become a husband in name only? He finished for her. There is context you both should understand. He set down his cup and straightened as though preparing to shoulder a burden. My parents' marriage was not harmonious. The outside world saw the perfect ducal couple, elegant, sophisticated, impeccably matched. Behind closed doors there was only bitterness and betrayal. Eleanor nodded slowly. I knew your mother. Before her marriage, she was a vibrant soul. Until my father crushed that vibrancy with systematic cruelty, Winterly said, his voice tightly controlled. He married her for her beauty and connections, then proceeded to break her spirit through indifference interspersed with calculated moments of charm, just enough to keep hope alive. Isolde felt a chill run through her. My father was careful to maintain appearances. He never struck her, never raised his voice where servants might hear. His method was more insidious. Lies, manipulations, and a particular talent for making her doubt her own worth, her own sanity. Eleanor's face had softened with understanding. And you feared becoming him. Winterly's hands tightened around his teacup. I swore I would never marry, never risk inflicting such misery on another human being, until I met Isolde. His eyes lifted to Isolde's face, raw with an emotion she had never seen there before. When we met, I felt something I had not believed possible, a connection that frightened me with its intensity. I told myself it was merely admiration, respect. But then the rumors began about your family's financial troubles, your reputation at risk. And you offered marriage as salvation. Isolde finished softly. I convinced myself it was the honorable course, Winterly admitted, that I could give you security without risking emotional entanglement, that a marriage of mutual respect without the dangers of passion was the safest path for both of us. Isolde felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. For 3 years, she had believed he found her lacking, unappealing. The truth, it seemed, was both better and worse. So you kept your distance to protect me? From yourself? Winterly set down his cup with a hand that was not quite steady. From what I feared I might become. My father's blood runs in my veins, Isolde. I have his temper, his pride. I feared that if I allowed myself to love you fully, to claim you as my wife in every sense, that same darkness might emerge. Eleanor made a sound of impatience. Forgive me, Your Grace, but that is absolute nonsense. Both Isolde and Winterly turned to her in surprise. You chose to believe you would inevitably become your father, Eleanor continued, unintimidated. And in doing so, you inflicted a different kind of cruelty on my niece. The cruelty of rejection without explanation. The cruelty of withholding yourself and leaving her to believe she was somehow at fault. Aunt Eleanor, please, Isolde began, but Eleanor waved her protest away. No, this must be said. Your Grace, you speak of your father breaking your mother's spirit through indifference. Yet what have you done these 3 years but show indifference to Isolde? Different motivation perhaps, but the result is the same. A woman left to wither without love. Winterly flinched as if struck. The parallel had clearly never occurred to him. I never intended, he began, then stopped, the truth of Eleanor's words sinking in. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional crack from the fire. What happens now? Isolde finally asked, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within her. Winterly looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in their marriage. That depends entirely on you, he said quietly. I have no right to ask your forgiveness, nor to expect you would wish to continue a marriage that has brought you such unhappiness. Isolde considered his words, and the man before her, so different from the cold, distant husband she had known. Here was vulnerability, honesty, perhaps even the capacity for tenderness she had once believed him incapable of showing. "I don't know if I can forgive 3 years in a moment," she said truthfully, "but I would like to understand. To know the man I married, not just the Duke who shares my home." A flicker of hope crossed Winterly's face. "And if understanding leads only to confirmation that we are ill-suited, then we shall address that possibility when it arises," Isolde replied. "But I think perhaps we have never truly given ourselves the chance to discover if we might suit very well indeed." Eleanor rose abruptly. "I believe you two have much to discuss that doesn't require my presence. I shall visit my neighbor Mrs. Thaxton, who has been begging for my apple preserves recipe. I shan't return until evening." With remarkable efficiency, she collected her shawl and was gone, leaving the Duke and Duchess alone in a silence that seemed to vibrate with possibility. "Stay," Winterly said suddenly. "Not forever, I wouldn't presume. But for a time, here, where we're removed from the expectations and eyes of society, where we might learn if there is anything between us worth salvaging." The rawness of his plea, so unlike his usual careful control, moved Isolde more than she cared to admit. "And if I choose to return to London?" she asked. "What then?" "Then I shall respect your wishes," he said simply, "and endeavor to give you as much freedom within our marriage as propriety allows." Isolde rose and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where late autumn flowers still bloomed defiantly against the coming winter. A week, she decided. We shall have 1 week here, away from Ravensworth House and the Tun, away from the roles we've played for 3 years. 1 week to discover if there is anything real between the Duke and Duchess beyond their titles. Winterly's relief was palpable. "A week," he agreed, "and at its end whatever you decide I shall abide by." What neither said aloud was that in 1 week they would need to unlearn 3 years of careful distance, of unspoken pain, of misunderstandings built upon fear, and that even if they succeeded, the path forward would be neither simple nor assured. Eleanor's cottage, with its modest proportions and simple comforts, forced an intimacy upon the Duke and Duchess that had never existed in the grand, echoing spaces of Ravensworth House. There were no separate wings to retreat to, no army of servants to act as buffers between them. Here they took meals at the same small table, sat before the same hearth in the evenings, and navigated around each other in spaces that required awareness of the other's presence. On the second day of their agreed-upon week, rain confined them indoors. Isolde sat by the window with her embroidery, while Winterly attempted to occupy himself with a book from Eleanor's limited library. "I never knew you enjoyed needlework," he observed after watching her for some time. "At Ravensworth, I rarely saw you engage in it." Isolde glanced up, surprised by the overture. "I find it soothing, though I'm not particularly skilled. My mother excelled at it. These flowers will never match her delicacy of stitch." Winterly set aside his book and moved to examine her work more closely. "I think them quite beautiful. The colors you've chosen are unusual but harmonious." The compliment, so unexpected and specific, brought a flush to Isolde's cheeks. "Thank you. I've often thought traditional patterns too rigid. I prefer to choose colors as they appeal to me rather than as they ought to be." "A rebellion in thread and silk," he said, a hint of amusement warming his voice. Isolde smiled despite herself. Perhaps the only rebellion permitted a duchess. Something in her tone made his expression sober. "Have I been so restrictive?" Isolde considered the question seriously, grateful for the opportunity to speak truths long held silent. "Not deliberately, I think. But the role itself is constraining. There are so many things a duchess must never do, never say, never want." She returned to her stitching, adding a bold splash of deep purple to a flower that in nature would never bear such a color. "Tell me what you would do if there were no constraints," Winterly said, his eyes intent on her face. "If you were not the Duchess of Ravensworth but simply Isolde." The question startled her. No one had asked her such a thing in years, perhaps ever. What would she do unconstrained by title and expectation? "I would travel," she said slowly, the answer emerging as she spoke it. "Not to the usual places, Paris, Rome, but to wilder locations. Scotland, the Lake District. I would sketch what I saw, badly but enthusiastically. I would read novels society deems unsuitable. I would speak my mind without calculating the social cost of every word. Winterly was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. What else? Emboldened by his apparent interest, she continued. I would visit our tenants more often, not just as the benevolent duchess distributing charity, but as a woman genuinely concerned with their welfare. I've done what I could through your steward, but there's so much more that could be accomplished with direct involvement. The Duke's brow furrowed slightly. You've been working with Harrington on estate matters? Isolde tensed, fearing disapproval, but answered honestly, yes, for the past 2 years. He's been very patient with my interference. Instead of the rebuke she expected, Winterly looked troubled. I had no idea you had such interest in estate management. Why did you never speak of it? Isolde set down her embroidery. Because you never asked, Winterly, about my interests, my thoughts, my desires. We have breakfasted together nearly every day for 3 years, and in all that time you've never once asked what occupies my mind or my hours. The blunt assessment hung between them, uncomfortable but undeniably true. I have been inexcusably self-absorbed, Winterly finally said, the admission clearly difficult for him. Preoccupied with maintaining distance, I failed to see the remarkable woman before me. Isolde felt a dangerous warmth spread through her chest at his words, but caution held it in check. It was too easy to be swayed by pretty phrases after years of longing for acknowledgement. Pretty words come easily in a moment of reflection, she said, more sharply than intended. It is daily attention that reveals true regard. Winterly did not bristle at her skepticism as she half expected. Instead, he nodded slowly. You're right to doubt. Words are easy. It is consistent action that builds trust. He hesitated, then added quietly, I would like the chance to demonstrate that I can change, Isolde. Not just in word, but in deed. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Isolde had learned to protect her heart. We shall see, she said simply, returning to her embroidery. The rain continued through the afternoon, drumming steadily on the roof. Eleanor had left them a cold collation for luncheon before departing for her visit, and as evening approached, the practical question of dinner arose. Aunt Eleanor mentioned that Mrs. Simmons usually prepares the evening meal, but she won't venture out in this weather, Isolde said, surveying the kitchen's modest provisions. I suppose I could attempt something simple. Winterly looked genuinely startled. You cook? Isolde couldn't help but laugh at his expression. Don't look so alarmed, Your Grace. I'm hardly an expert, but I did learn some basics after my parents died. Before you rescued me with your proposal, I was facing the very real possibility of a much reduced circumstance. He watched as she assessed the pantry contents. Let me help. Now it was Isolde's turn to look startled. You? Cook? Winterly's lips quirked in what might almost have been a smile. I am not entirely useless outside a ballroom, Duchess. I was a soldier before I was a duke. I can manage a simple meal without poisoning us both. Isolde tried to picture the immaculate Duke of Ravensworth preparing food and found the image improbable at best. Yet here he was, rolling up his fine linen shirt sleeves and examining the pantry with unexpected competence. Together, they managed a passable meal of soup and freshly baked bread, working side by side in the small kitchen with a coordination that surprised them both. Winterly proved unexpectedly adept at bread making, his strong hands working the dough with confidence. Where did you learn this? Isolde asked as she watched him. Army life teaches unusual skills, he replied. And after my father died when I first became duke, I sometimes escaped to the kitchens at Ravensworth. The cook there, Mrs. Winter's mother, took pity on a young man overwhelmed by sudden responsibility and taught me to bake bread. She said there was something steadying about the process. Isolde tried to imagine the young man he must have been then, suddenly burdened with a title and all its responsibilities, seeking solace in the simple act of creating something with his hands. How old were you? She asked. 22, he replied, his focus on the dough before him. Too young for such responsibility, though I would never have admitted it then. They ate their simple meal by the fire, the storm still raging outside. Isolde found herself studying her husband's face in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow she had noticed but never dared ask about, the way his eyes reflected the flames. "The scar," he said suddenly, catching her gaze. "You're wondering about it." Isolde flushed at being caught staring. Yes. I've often wondered. Childhood mishap," he explained, touching it briefly. "I was 8, convinced I could climb to the top of the oak behind Ravensworth. I was wrong. The image of a young, adventurous Winterly was charming and unexpected. Were you a reckless child?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Until my father put a stop to it," he admitted. "After that, I learned the value of control and decorum." There it was again, the shadow of his father, shaping the man before her in ways both seen and unseen. As they cleared away the dishes together, another novel experience, Isolde found herself wondering who Winterly might have been without that shadow, without the fear that had led him to hold himself apart from her, from genuine connection. As if reading her thoughts, Winterly paused in his task, a plate still in his hand. "I've been a poor husband to you, Isolde," he said quietly, "but I'm beginning to believe I might learn to be a better one. If you'll allow it." The vulnerability in his voice, so at odds with the controlled Duke she had known, touched something in Isolde she had thought long deadened. She took the plate from his hands and set it aside. Then, in a moment of courage, placed her palm against his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the slight roughness of evening stubble unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Winterly stood perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this unprecedented contact between them. "I would like that," she said softly, "for both our sakes." For a moment, they remained thus, connected by the simple touch of her hand against his face, by the honest words between them. Then, slowly, Winterly covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press his lips against her palm in a gesture so tender it brought tears to Isolde's eyes. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was perhaps the beginning of something new, something that might, with care and courage, grow into the marriage they should have had from the start. Outside, the storm continued, but within the cottage, something that had been frozen for 3 long years had begun at last to thaw. The third day dawned clear and cold, the world washed clean by the previous day's storm. Isolde woke early, drawn by the crisp sunlight streaming through the cottage window. She found Winterly already up, standing in the garden with a steaming cup in his hand, surveying the glistening landscape. He had dispensed with his usual formal attire, wearing only a simple shirt and riding breeches. With his hair slightly tousled by the morning breeze, he looked younger, more approachable than the impeccable Duke she was accustomed to. "Good morning," she said, pulling her shawl tighter as she joined him. He turned, and the smile that greeted her was unguarded, genuine in a way she had rarely seen. "Good morning," he replied. "I hope I didn't wake you." Isolde shook her head. "I've always been an early riser. At Ravensworth, I often watched the sunrise from the east terrace." A look of surprise crossed his face. "As do I. How is it possible we never encountered each other? The estate is large, and perhaps—" Isolde hesitated, then finished honestly. "Perhaps we were both careful to avoid unexpected meetings." Winterly acknowledged this with a nod. "Another mistake among many. To think of the conversations we might have had, the mornings we might have shared." An unexpected surge of boldness prompted Isolde to ask, "Why did you marry me, Winterly? The true reason, not the practical considerations you listed yesterday." He was silent for a moment, his gaze returning to the distant hills. "Because when you entered the Harrington ballroom 4 years ago, the world stopped. Because you smiled at old Lady Weatherby when everyone else avoided her for fear of her sharp tongue. Because you sat with the wallflowers and made them laugh instead of competing for the attention of eligible gentlemen." He turned back to her, his expression open in a way she had never seen before. "Because something in me recognized something in you, though I was too afraid to name it. Too afraid to claim it." Isolde felt her breath catch. Had he truly seen her so clearly, felt so deeply, even while maintaining such careful distance? "I thought you proposed from pity," she admitted, "or perhaps calculation, that I would make a suitable duchess without demanding more of you than you wished to give." "There was calculation," he acknowledged, "but not as you imagine. I calculated that if I married you but kept emotional distance between us, I might have something of what I wanted without risking becoming my father, without risking hurting you as he hurt my mother. I hurt regardless, Isolde said softly. Winterly closed his eyes briefly, pain evident in his expression. Yes, I see that now. In trying to protect you from one harm, I inflicted another. They stood in silence for a moment, the morning air crisp between them. Would you walk with me? Winterly asked suddenly. There's a path beyond the garden that Eleanor mentioned leads to a rather spectacular view. Isolde nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Physical movement might help process the emotional complexities between them. They walked side by side along the narrow country path, close enough that occasionally their hands or shoulders brushed, each contact sending a small thrill through Isolde, despite her best efforts at composure. Tell me about your work with the tenants, Winterly said as they climbed a gentle rise. What changes have you implemented that I've been too blind to notice? Surprised and pleased by his interest, Isolde began to explain the small improvements she had quietly overseen. A school for the tenants' children, improvements to cottages before winter, adjustments to lease terms that eased burdens without reducing estate income. As she spoke, Winterly listened with genuine attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed a quick understanding of the issues involved. By the time they reached the hilltop Eleanor had recommended, Isolde found herself animated in a way she hadn't been in years, gesturing as she described her future plans for the estate. You're remarkable, Winterly said when she finally paused for breath. I've had stewards and managers with decades of experience who haven't shown half your insight into estate management. Isolde flushed with pleasure at the genuine admiration in his voice. I had good teachers in my parents. Father believed that caring for those under our protection was the first duty of privilege. Winterly nodded thoughtfully. My father held different views. He saw tenants as little more than a source of income, tools to maintain the estate's grandeur. And you? Isolde asked, genuinely curious about the man behind the ducal mask. What do you believe? I believed my duty was to be unlike him in every possible way, Winterly admitted. But in focusing so intently on not being my father, I failed to determine who I actually wished to be, what I actually believed. He gazed out at the sweeping vista before them, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, a patchwork of fields and forests between. I think I would like to be the kind of landowner who sees people, not just holdings, who builds something meaningful, not just maintains tradition. He turned to her, his expression open. I think I would like to work alongside you, if you're willing to teach me what you know. The offer, so unexpected, so contrary to their previous dynamic, left Isolde momentarily speechless. You would accept guidance from your wife in estate matters? She asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Winterly's mouth quirked in a small, self-deprecating smile. I am trying to become a man worthy of your respect, Isolde. False pride would be a poor beginning. Impulsively, Isolde reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, warm and strong, and they stood thus for several moments, hands linked, looking out over the landscape. I would like that, she finally said. To work together, to build something meaningful. The smile that transformed Winterly's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Gradual, then suddenly brilliant, revealing a man she had glimpsed only in fleeting moments during their courtship. As they descended the hill, still hand in hand, Isolde found herself contemplating the strangeness of their situation, how it had taken her leaving, the dissolution of all pretense between them, to create the possibility of a true beginning. The remainder of the day passed in a kind of suspended reality, away from the pressures and patterns of their London life. They took a simple luncheon in the garden, read aloud to each other from Eleanor's modest library, and spoke of small, ordinary things, preferences and memories, dislikes and habits. The basic knowledge of each other they had never bothered to acquire. By evening, when Eleanor returned from her conveniently extended visit, she found them seated before the fire, Isolde teaching Winterly the basics of embroidery with much laughter at his clumsy attempts. Well, Eleanor observed dryly, taking in the scene. This is a transformation indeed. Aunt Eleanor, Isolde greeted her, suddenly conscious of how dramatically things had shifted between herself and Winterly in just 3 days. Winterly rose, setting aside the embroidery hoop with evident relief. "Lady Eleanor, I hope your visit was pleasant." "Illuminating," Eleanor replied cryptically. "I see you two have been making progress of your own." Later, after Winterly had retired to the small guest room, Eleanor cornered Isolde in the kitchen. "You're softening toward him," she observed. Isolde busied herself with arranging teacups. "He's different here. Or perhaps he's allowing me to see parts of himself he's always kept hidden." Eleanor studied her niece carefully. "Be cautious, Isolde. 3 days of charm cannot erase 3 years of neglect. Men like your Duke are often at their best when seeking to regain what they fear they've lost." "I know," Isolde said quietly, "but I believe his remorse is genuine. And there is something between us, Aunt Eleanor. Something that might have been wonderful from the beginning had fear not intervened." Eleanor's expression softened. "Then I hope, for both your sakes, that you find your way to that wonderful thing. But do not rush, my dear. Make sure this new leaf is truly turned before you commit your heart again." As Isolde lay in bed that night, she reflected on her aunt's warning. Was she being naive, too eager to believe in Winterly's transformation? Was this merely a temporary change born of the shock of her departure? And yet the man she had glimpsed these past days seemed more real, more substantial than the perfect, distant Duke she had married. There was a genuineness to his attention, a vulnerability in his honesty that could not be easily feigned. Tomorrow marked the midpoint of their agreed-upon week. 4 days left to determine if what was growing between them was strong enough to weather a return to London, to the roles and responsibilities that had shaped their previous pattern. 4 days to decide if the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth might, against all odds, find their way to becoming truly husband and wife. On the morning of the 7th day, the final day of their agreed-upon week, Isolde woke with a sense of impending loss. The past days had transformed her understanding of the man she had married, revealing depths and possibilities she had long ceased hoping for. They had spent hours in conversation, discovering shared interests and complementary perspectives that had remained hidden during 3 years of careful distance. They had laughed together, worked together in Eleanor's garden, even argued, respectfully but passionately, about books and ideas. Most surprisingly, they had touched, simple, tentative contacts that grew gradually more natural. A hand offered to help her over a stile during a country walk, his fingers brushing hers as he passed a teacup. One rain-soaked afternoon, he had even read aloud to her, her head resting hesitantly against his shoulder. They had not discussed what would happen when the week ended. The question hung between them, unspoken but ever present, growing more urgent as their time in this suspended reality dwindled. Isolde dressed simply in one of the country gowns she had brought, no longer concerned with presenting a ducal appearance. When she entered the cottage's main room, she found Winterly already there, staring into the fire with an expression of such intense contemplation that he didn't immediately notice her presence. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned, and something in his eyes, a mixture of warmth and apprehension, made her heart beat faster. "Isolde," he acknowledged, using her given name as had become his habit during their time at the cottage. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," she replied, though in truth she had lain awake for hours weighing possibilities, considering futures that diverged dramatically depending on the choice she would make today. Eleanor had tactfully announced the previous evening that she would be spending the day with friends in the village, giving them privacy for this final, crucial conversation. "Shall we walk?" Winterly suggested. "The day is fine, and I think more clearly outdoors." They set out along a now familiar path, comfortable silence between them as they climbed the hill that had become their favorite vantage point. The morning was crisp and clear, the autumn colors brilliant under the sunshine. At the summit, they paused, looking out over the patchwork landscape below. Isolde waited, sensing that Winterly needed to speak first. "Before you tell me your decision," he finally said, his gaze still on the distant horizon, "I would like to make one thing clear." He turned to her then, his expression more open, more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "These past days have been the happiest of my life, Isolde. Not because we've been playing at a simple existence, but because for the first time, I've allowed myself to truly know you, and to let you know me." Isolde felt her breath catch at the naked honesty in his voice. Whatever you decide today, whether you return to London as my Duchess, seek a separate establishment, or prefer the discretion of a country residence away from me, I want you to know that these days have changed me irrevocably. He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. I cannot return to the man I was, the distant, fearful husband who kept you at arm's length. That man is gone. In his place is someone who understands too late perhaps what a gift he was given and how carelessly he treated it. Tears pricked at Isolde's eyes, but she blinked them back, needing clarity for this crucial moment between them. I don't want to return to what we were, she said quietly. That marriage was a beautiful shell, empty inside. Winterly nodded, pain flickering across his features. I know, and I would not ask it of you. He drew a deep breath, then spoke words she had never expected to hear from the controlled, proper Duke of Ravensworth. I love you, Isolde. I think perhaps I have since the moment you smiled at cantankerous old Lady Weatherby at that long-ago ball. I was too afraid to acknowledge it then, too bound by my father's shadow to reach for happiness. But I am acknowledging it now, whatever the consequences. Isolde felt the world shift beneath her feet, his declaration realigning everything she had believed about their marriage, about the man before her. How can you be certain? She asked, needing to test the truth of his words. A week of country living, of freedom from ducal responsibilities. It changes perspective temporarily, but London awaits. Responsibilities await. How can you know this feeling will endure? Winterly's gaze didn't waver, because even in London, behind all my careful walls, I watched you. I noticed how you treated the servants with kindness, how you remembered details about our tenants' families, how you slipped extra coins to street children when you thought no one was looking. A small smile touched his lips. I even knew about your sunrise visits to the East Terrace. I sometimes watched from my study window, telling myself I was merely ensuring your safety. His confession startled a laugh from her. You were spying on me? Admiring from a distance, he corrected, his smile widening briefly before sobering again. Too much of a coward to join you, to reach for what I wanted. Isolde studied his face. The face she had tried so hard to read for 3 years, that had remained impassive through countless dinners and social events. Now it was open to her, every emotion visible. Hope, fear, regret, and yes, what appeared to be genuine love. If I return with you to London, she said slowly, things must be different. Truly different. Not just for a week or a month, but permanently. Winterly nodded. Tell me what you need, what you want. I will move heaven and earth to provide it. Isolde took a deep breath, organizing thoughts she had been considering throughout the night. I want a true marriage, she began. Not just in name, but in substance. I want to be your partner, not merely your Duchess. I want to work alongside you in managing our estates, to have a voice in decisions that affect our future. Winterly nodded, listening intently. I want honesty between us, even when it's difficult. No more walls, no more careful distance. I want to know when you're troubled, when you're happy, when you need support. Her courage mounting, she continued. I want a marriage bed that isn't empty. I want children, Winterly. A family. Color rose in his cheeks at her directness, but he didn't look away. And I want to know that if the old fears return, if your father's ghost begins to haunt you again, you will speak of it, not retreat behind walls I cannot breach. When she finished, Winterly was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Then, to her surprise, he knelt before her on the hillside, taking both her hands in his. I swear to you, Isolde Fairmont, Duchess of Ravensworth, that if you will grant me the chance to be the husband you deserve, I will spend every day of our life together, honoring these requests. I will be your partner, your confidant, your lover, and the father of our children. I will share with you my fears and my joys, my burdens and my triumphs. His voice grew husky with emotion. And I will love you, openly, honestly, completely, for all the days that remain to us, if you will have me. Isolde felt tears spill down her cheeks, too moved by his unprecedented display to maintain her composure. In all her imaginings of how this conversation might unfold, she had never envisioned the proud Duke of Ravensworth on his knees before her. offering not just reconciliation but a complete transformation of their marriage. "Rise, Winterly," she said softly, tugging at his hands. "A duke should not kneel." "For you I would kneel 1,000 times," he replied, but rose as she requested, still holding her hands. "You have not answered me, Duchess. Will you return to London, not as the woman who left, but as my true wife at last?" Isolde looked up at him. This man she had married in hope, endured in disappointment, and perhaps against all odds, might now love in truth. "Yes," she said simply, "I will return with you, not to what was, but to what might be." The smile that transformed Winterly's face was like nothing she had seen before, radiant with joy, with relief, with something that looked remarkably like love. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he bent his head toward hers. Their first true kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When Isolde responded, rising on her toes to press more firmly against his lips, Winterly's arms encircled her waist, drawing her close as the kiss deepened, 3 years of distance dissolving in the space of heartbeats. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Winterly rested his forehead against hers, his voice low and fervent. "I will not fail you again, Isolde. This I swear." She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "See that you don't, Your Grace. For I shall not disappear a second time. I shall confront you directly, and you may find that more alarming than my absence." Winterly laughed, the sound unfamiliar but wonderful. "I welcome it. Every argument, every disagreement, every passion. For they will be real, Isolde. We will be real at last." As they descended the hill hand in hand, Isolde reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. Her impulsive flight, meant as an escape, had instead become a beginning, not just of a new chapter in their marriage, but of the true marriage they should have had from the start. 7 days had transformed what 3 years could not. 7 days of honesty, of vulnerability, of walls deliberately dismantled rather than maintained. Perhaps love did indeed grow best in absence, she thought. For sometimes one had to step away to truly see what was worth returning to. And the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth, walking hand in hand toward a future suddenly rich with possibility, were finally ready to claim the love that had waited, patient and undeniable, for 3 long years. London, 1816. 1 year later, Lady Whistledown's society papers caused quite the commotion at breakfast tables across London that spring morning. The Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth welcomed a daughter in the early hours of yesterday morning. Mother and child are reported to be in excellent health, and the Duke, according to reliable sources, has scarcely left their side. How remarkable to witness such transformation in a marriage once whispered to be among the coldest in the ton. This author recalls a time not so long ago when the Duke and his Duchess could scarcely be found in the same room, let alone gazing adoringly at one another over a cradle. Eleanor Fairmont set aside the scandal sheet with a smile, watching her niece across the sunny breakfast room at Ravensworth House. Isolde sat in her morning robe, her daughter nestled in her arms, while the Duke of Ravensworth, still in his shirt sleeves, his cravat discarded, knelt beside them, one finger captured in his daughter's tiny grip. "My dear Isolde," Eleanor observed, "Lady Whistledown has pronounced your marriage a success. I believe that constitutes official approval from society." Isolde laughed softly. "How fortunate for us, though I hardly require her approval when I have all I need right here." She smiled down at her daughter, Eleanor Rose Ravensworth, named for the aunt whose cottage had witnessed the rebirth of a marriage. The past year had indeed transformed the union between the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth. Their return to London had initially sparked intense speculation. First about the Duchess's mysterious disappearance, then about the noticeable change in the Duke's behavior toward his wife. Where once he had been politely distant at social functions, he now remained at her side, his hand often at the small of her back. His attention focused on her even amid the most glittering company. Where once they had arrived and departed separately, they now shared a carriage, their heads often bent together in private conversation. Most shocking to society was the Duke's unprecedented decision to include his Duchess in estate matters, openly seeking her counsel on improvements and investments. Some older peers had declared it unseemly, but their opinion mattered little to the Ravensworths, who had discovered that partnership yielded better results than traditional separation of spheres. And then there had been the most significant change, one that became apparent several months after their return, when the Duchess's subtly changing figure announced the impending arrival of an heir. Winterly set aside his daughter's birth announcement, which he had been revising for the newspapers. Perfect, he declared, admiring his wife and child. Utterly perfect. I'm hardly perfect at present, Isolde protested with a laugh. I'm exhausted. My hair is a disaster, and according to the doctor, I shall not fit into my favorite gowns for months. Winterly rose and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then you are perfectly imperfect, and all the more beautiful for it. Eleanor watched their easy affection with satisfaction. The change in her niece was profound, not just the obvious joy of new motherhood, but a deeper contentment, a security that came from being truly known and loved. And the Duke, that cold, controlled man who had appeared at her cottage door a year ago, had undergone an even more remarkable transformation. He smiled readily now, laughed often, and looked at his wife as though she were the sun around which his world revolved. There had been challenges, of course. Old habits did not disappear overnight. There had been moments when Winterly retreated behind walls of reserve, when the ghost of his father threatened to resurface in moments of stress or uncertainty. But true to his promise, he had spoken of these struggles rather than hiding them, allowing Isolde to remind him that he was not his father, would never be his father. And Isolde herself had needed to learn to trust again, to believe that the changes between them were permanent, rather than temporary accommodations. Each day of consistent care and attention from Winterly had built that trust, brick by brick, until it stood solid and unshakable. I must return to Derbyshire next week, Eleanor said, rising from the breakfast table. My roses will be blooming, and I've neglected them too long. You'll visit again soon? Isolde asked, reluctant to see her aunt depart after the week she had spent with them awaiting the birth. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. Perhaps in the autumn. That cottage grows lonely sometimes, even for a confirmed spinster like myself. Then you must consider it only a secondary residence, Winterly said firmly. You will always have a place here, Lady Eleanor. We owe you more than we can ever repay. Eleanor waved away his gratitude. Nonsense. I merely provided the setting. You two did the difficult work yourselves. After Eleanor had left the room, Winterly settled on the sofa beside Isolde, his arm around her shoulders, his daughter's tiny form cradled between them. Happy? He asked softly, a question he had asked many times over the past year, as if still amazed by his good fortune. Isolde leaned against him, content in a way she had once believed impossible. Perfectly, she replied. Outside the windows of Ravensworth House, London society continued its endless rounds of gossip and speculation. New scandals would soon replace the story of the Duke and Duchess's transformed marriage. New whispers would circulate at balls and dinner parties. But within the walls of their home, no longer a house divided by silence and separate chambers, the Duke and Duchess had created something rare and precious. A true marriage built on honesty, partnership, and a love that had needed only courage to flourish. For sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a dramatic departure, but with a return. Not with an ending, but with the courage to begin again. And the Duchess, who had once disappeared, would never need to flee again, having found in her husband's transformed heart the home she had always sought. As Lady Whistledown might observe, in matters of the heart, dear reader, it is never too late for a new beginning. And perhaps, just perhaps, love does indeed grow best in absence, for nothing makes the heart more aware of its true desires than the fear of losing them forever. The story of the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth reminds us that true love requires courage. The courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, and to begin again when all seems lost. Their journey from a marriage of convenience to a union of hearts shows us that transformation is possible when we dare to step beyond our fears and truly see the person before us. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and second chances, please subscribe to the channel for more stories that warm the heart and inspire the soul. Like this video if you believe in the power of new beginnings, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to find love. or to reclaim it when it seems lost. Until our next story unfolds, remember that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people, but about imperfect hearts finding their perfect match. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Regency London. I'll see you in our next adventure.